No metaphor is perfect, but what I mean by this is that our experiences of the world, and of the self too, but let's stay with the world for now, are not direct reflections of some objective reality, like as if the world was just there and it poured itself directly into our minds through our eyes and our ears. It might seem like that. We open our eyes in the morning or after anesthesia, and it just seems as though the world is there, and it has all these properties like color and shape and size and sound. And our brains don't seem to have much to do with it, but our brains have everything to do with it. And the idea, and it's not a new idea, is that instead of our perceptual conscious experience of the world being a process of reading the world out in this kind of outside-in direction, it's a process of active interpretation in which the brain is always trying to make its best guess about what's out there in the world on the basis of sensory information that comes in through the senses, but is ambiguous and noisy, and it doesn't have labels on. Like, it doesn't have a label saying, I'm from a red thing or I'm from a car. It's just electrical activity. And the brain has to make sense of it. And the idea is that it does so by basically having an internal model of the most likely causes of the sensory signals that it gets. And what we experience is not a readout of the sensory signal, but the brain's predictions about what causes those signals. And this is a pretty big flip in how we relate to our experiences, because even though it seems they come from the outside in, they're actually, I think, coming from the inside out. And the sensory signals are there to keep our brain's predictions, our brain's best guesses, tied to reality in ways that are useful for our behavior as a complex organism. That's where the metaphor of controlled hallucination comes from. Hallucination because experiences are internally generated. And when we think about hallucinations in everyday language, we typically think about something that's generated internally rather than something that's registering the outside world. But critically, the control is just as important. In normal everyday perception, our perceptual experiences don't just wander off into whatever they might be. They're very carefully regulated, controlled by the world and the body. And that's why perception, of course, works. That's why evolution has developed it that way so that it's useful for us.
Yeah, talk to me about how an evolutionary or a sort of an ancestrally adaptive lens plays a role here. Why is it that we would have evolved this particular type of ability? Why is it that we would be making these predictions? What advantage does it give us, and how does that work?
I think it makes things a lot easier for complex organisms. It has to, maybe especially so for complex creatures like us. If there were a one-to-one correspondence between some sort of sensory information and something in the world and what we should do about it, then we might not need any complex business of making predictions inside our brains. But things aren't like that. Way back in philosophy, Immanuel Kant pointed out or made the argument that we can never perceive the world as it really is. We only perceive an interpretation, a transformation of it through a sensory veil. And sensory information that we get is not reliable. It's noisy, it's uncertain, it might come from different things. It changes according to the context, according to the environment, according to lighting conditions. And so to get a reliable indication of what's going on in the world, it's not enough simply just to funnel sensory information into the brain. It has to be interpreted. And mathematically, there's a way in which one might do this like optimally, completely perfectly. But this turns out to not really be possible for things to do in practice. So this whole process by which the brain makes a prediction of what's out there and then uses sensory information to update these predictions, that turns out to be a very, very good approximation for how any kind of system would solve this problem of figuring out what's there under conditions of uncertainty.
Why not just absorb what's there? I don't know if I'm being thick here, but why not just observe it the way that it is? Why do this other thing?
Well, take color, for example. Take our experiences of color. Now, when we experience color, this is a useful thing for brains to provide our experience with, right? Because colors allow us to keep track of surfaces when lighting conditions change. They highlight things we might miss, like the color of a ripe fruit in a tree. Very, very useful. But where are colors in the world? Colors don't exist out there in objective reality. Anyway, there's just electromagnetic radiation that goes from radio waves to gamma waves. And our eyes are only sensitive to 3 wavelengths of that radiation. And out of those 3 wavelengths, we experience millions of colors. So when we experience color, we're experiencing simultaneously less than what's there, because it's just 3 wavelengths out of a long, vast spectrum, and more than, because we experience millions of colors, not just 3. So in this case, it wouldn't really be very useful for us to experience what's really there, because what would that mean? Would it mean that we experienced a continuous kind of set of wavelengths from kilometer long to whatever X-ray, however long those are? It's not even clear what that would mean to experience that. And yet we don't even experience a small subset of that. The brain creates something out of the sensory environment that is very useful for us. But you can put it even more simply, like, what's really out there? Is it objects, or is it atoms, or is it quantum foam or something? Nobody really knows what's out there anyway. So to put as a benchmark experiencing things as they really are is, I think, just to misunderstand what kind of business a brain is in. It's in the business of helping us stay alive.
This doesn't feel... Is it Donald Hoffman? Is that the guy that's got the kind of ideas that the world is very different out there? This doesn't feel a million miles away from what he talks about.
It is similar in some ways. So yeah, Don Hoffman has his idea of an interface theory of perception, which is that what we experience is some kind of user interface, which intervenes between how the world really is and something that's useful for us to survive by. We agree in the sense that the contents of experience are indirectly related to what's going on out there in the world. But there are 2 places where we disagree. One is this metaphor of a user interface, I think, is problematic because it suggests that there's some kind of mini-me inside my head, looking at this interface, much as I might look at a computer screen and clicking on this icon or that icon. Whereas back to the self, I think the self is part of the interface. There is no me that's separate from the flow of experience. And I think things that smuggle back in this inner homunculus is not the way to go. And then we also disagree, and this is something that I've talked to him a few times about. He then also makes a whole bunch of claims about the real nature of what's out there in terms of little conscious agents everywhere. And I've not yet been persuaded by his ideas on that. I might be in the future, but I haven't been yet. And you don't have to go that far. You can still just try to understand the nature of perception as solving this indirectness between how things are in the world and what's the best way for the brain to make sense of things in order to survive.